Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. We are in episode 28. Wow. So, and it's been, we're starting to finish up the summer, and it is always interesting to see what tech news comes out. This week, we definitely noticed that there were a bunch of announcements made that were a little bit more philosophical in nature, actually, which we'll get into. But before we do that, Charlie, how have you been?
Just sort of buckling in, hanging on. The summer has been not actually that it's been fairly busy. I think COVID introduced this whole new thing where we used to have it was really dying down during summer, and I think we're seeing some of that, but it's more year round these days. So I've been very busy, which is a good thing, but sort of ready for the fall. So I'm looking forward to it. Fall is my favorite time in New York, so we're excited about it.
Nice. And for me, fall always means trade show season. So I'm ready to pack up my bags and head out for the next 3 months.
As always.
Yeah. Uh, so speaking of, one of the companies that has me traveling all over the place is Salesforce, not coincidentally. So probably the most interesting news that happened this week from a vendor-driven perspective was Salesforce announcing a framework for creating open source large multimodal models. So LMMs to be differentiated from the LLMs, large language models that we normally talk about. So they've created this open source framework for analyzing text, images, and other digital media, and that will help companies to be able to develop open source LMMs, which is interesting because right now there's a bit of a gap between open source performance and kind of the proprietary performance of LMMs. But honestly, nobody's really all that good at it yet.
Yeah, to me, there's three interesting things to this story. The first is that this is the first significant foray into the sort of acknowledgement and recognition that we are not, as humans, large language models. We do not see and understand and perceive the world through language only. There's all these other elements, which certainly we've touched on multimodal. But one of the things, OpenAI and Anthropic have gone down that road. But one of the things that this particular model does, or this approach, because it's the Salesforce researchers, it's not like this is not a go-to-market product, is something that they're calling interleaved data, and this idea that you have text and images and conceptually, I think other, but at least images, interspersed within the text and contextualized, and it can have multiple images. And so the premise being that, if you think about literally anything that one of us produces as a report, any magazine article, there's always images and text together, and they provide context to each other, and they're not separated. And that's what this model is attempting to do. And that alone, just from a raw a raw technology perspective, is interesting, and something that we've talked about in the past is that these LLMs are going to continue to evolve, and maybe they're going to evolve into LMMs. Just we need another acronym. So I think that there's that part. The second part that's fascinating to me is that while we certainly have talked about here on the show and have covered that Salesforce is certainly in the AI business with Einstein and other things, I was not aware that they were trying to get into the foundation model business and had anything going at that level, particularly because there's nothing in this report anyway that any of this is really specific to like Salesforce's core business. So that was a big like, wow, that's really fascinating that they've decided to sort of throw their hat in the ring. And I would argue they're big enough to play with the big guys, but it does, as we've talked about, it's an expensive space to play. Is this a smart move for them, or is this just a research endeavor? And then if so, well, then why? And then the last piece of this is that was interesting is they've released it as open source, which, as we'll talk about in a moment, is this whole other area of open source versus proprietary. What is open source? Why did they do that? And how does that help with all of this? So it's really fascinating on kind of a whole bunch of different dimensions.
Yeah, I agree. And although it is hard for me to wrap my brain around this sometimes. Salesforce is now a company that has 70,000 plus employees. They are gigantic. And for those of us who have been in tech for a long time, we remember when Salesforce was this up and coming cloud-based CRM with a couple thousand employees. It was an interesting company, but it definitely was not a behemoth like it is now. And Salesforce literally has thousands of AI employees, actual data scientists who understand models, understand research, have PhDs. It's surprising to see from that angle. But when you think about text and images, I think one of the most interesting things there is that basic how-to directions on how to do anything, such as do-it-yourself carpentry or first aid, you will have text and then some sort of picture, text and some sort of picture. And right now, we don't analyze that very well because so much of our analysis of pictures is just based on metadata rather than actual contextual descriptions. So it makes sense that Salesforce would want to go there, especially for its service cloud, although I'm sure there are a lot of other uses. But practically, I could see this being productized in the Salesforce Service Cloud most easily as they're trying to teach customers what else to do. So it makes sense that they're going in this direction. And then the open source side, I think that's because Salesforce doesn't actually want to develop its own models. They want to give some sort of toolkit so that all of its gigantic Fortune 500 clients can have a starting point that is accessible to Salesforce at the end of the day. Rather, Salesforce doesn't need to get into the Hugging Face business or the data science platform business or all these other things that are interesting but not core to what Salesforce really cares about.
I mean, there's so first of all, I think the reason it's surprising isn't because Salesforce isn't big enough to do this. It's just that we don't typically think of them as a general purpose technology company like an Amazon or a right or a Google. But clearly they have the the heft to endeavor here, and there's a long history with companies like AT&T Bell Labs is the history, and Xerox Spark, right, where companies put out these research centers not necessarily because they're trying to monetize the technology, but because it creates a forum. Something I've preached a lot about it, right, where you're just exploring new ideas, and it gives a forum for that, and then out of that sometimes comes something that creates some form of competitive advantage or differentiation for you. So, there's nothing critical about this. I think it's fabulous. And I'm excited to maybe have somebody who doesn't have a, ulterior motive to any of this sort of kind of pursue it. I mean, I'm very skeptical of, I mean, the other major open source efforts out there are Elon Musk's XAI and Facebook, Meta's, what is it? What I forgot they're
Yeah.
called there,
Mhm.
Llama. And I'm incredibly skeptical of both of them, right? So, the idea of Salesforce sort of weighing in and putting something into the market, I think has much greater potential for being, genuinely useful without any real strings attached to it. Um, I think the big question, and this will lead to the second part of the second story,
Mhm.
is it in fact really open source? So, shoot, I should have brought this up. The name of the group that is sort of the standard bearer for open source, the Open Source Initiative, finally sort of weighed in and created a definition. I don't think I'd even call it a standard, a definition for open source AI. And basically, I mean, the easiest way of saying it is it needs to truly be open source if you're going to call it open source AI. I mean, it basically saying that to be qualified, it has to be used. You can use it for any purpose without permission. The researcher should be able to inspect all of its components and study that system works. It should be able to modify the system for any purpose, including changing its output and to share it with others to use with or without modifications. All this stuff, and I would argue when I read it, I don't know that any of the so-called open source AI models right now qualify. So, and I don't know if Salesforce is either. I mean, this article didn't talk about any restrictions or limitations on it. I mean, it sounds like right now it's more of a framework and an idea anyway. But it's I think it's this whole interesting question and leads into this broader, almost philosophical question as to the role of open source AI. Should this be in the public domain? I think there's at least a case to be made that it's too powerful and dangerous to be in the hands of a for-profit company, and also too potentially powerful and dangerous to just be sitting out there in the open. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure which side of this I land on.
Yeah, and I think another thing that makes open source models so difficult is simply that they're so big. It's not like you've got 1,000 lines of code that can be easily reviewed by any developer. In this case, you've got uh, gigabytes, petabytes, whatever, of data that are all being transformed into parameters that are then go through some sort of testing process, and then you get to the hyperparameterization, and then you get to the operationalization of looking at all of the outputs. So you've got all of these billions and of things that are working in conjunction in a way that isn't really very testable. So I wonder how valuable it is to truly make everything open source across the board in AI when it will take an army of people to honestly look through any LLM or LMM or LNMOMQMZM as we go through the alphabet.
I mean, the sticking point has always been the training data, and then of course the weighting and the coding and like you said, the tuning of that data during the training process. That's a little bit easier. That sort of metadata is a little bit easier to expose. The training data has been the big gotcha, and I don't see that really changing. There's that's the challenges. Frankly, most of the challenges we're seeing with all of this has to do with the training data. And then let's not forget the other issue is that it's sort of a black box. Even if you have all that, there's not really a guarantee that it's all actually going to turn out the same way. So there's all these variables around it. And to me, I look at this and say, well, to what let's get back to the CIO's perspective, right? How much does any of this matter? Well, I mean, I'm not sure it does insofar as I think that Salesforce doing this is like a good signaling. I was just talking to an executive about this, about the importance of signaling in the enterprise buying cycle. I think it's an important signaling of Salesforce to their customer base that says two things. That says, hey, we're big enough to play with the big boys. Look
Mhm.
at us in that way. And secondly, we're investing in trying to make the world better, and by virtue of that, your world better as being our customer. You're going to reap the benefits of what happens with it. But in pragmatic terms, as a CIO, while every enterprise has a ton of open source, they don't truly have open source in the way that it's quote unquote free, because the support issues, the management issues, all of that almost always dictates they're buying a vendor's version of it. We're going to talk about Grafana here in a minute, right? That's an
Right.
example of that. It's always how it works. And so the fact that any of these people put it out there for free, I think is relatively meaningless to the average enterprise. It's not going to be free for them. And even if it does, even if it was actually free, you have all the compute costs of training and inference that go with it. So it's never free. And so, I think it's an interesting sort of perspective, but I think you need to kind of take it with the appropriate grain, very large grain of salt.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking about where you just brought up Xerox PARC. Obviously, Apple's some of their biggest innovations actually came from uh, originally Xerox PARC creating this fantastic graphical GUI interface that turned into Windows and Mac. Uh, and then we look at Polaroid, which did a fantastic job with digital cameras, but it really didn't really take off until again the iPhone made the digital camera available to everyone. So these gigantic companies with fantastic research that really did a horrible job of releasing their technology to market led to their downfalls as companies. And I think Salesforce, at least making this research and the findings available to the rest of the world uh, at this point is a smart idea. They are not locking this up for 5 years and becoming irrelevant in the AI market. So regardless of how this ends up, it at least is a good move for the market in general that there is at least one other toolkit for looking at LMMs at this point.
Yeah, and again, they're it's not just. I mean, that's the other thing I think that they deserve some credit for. This isn't just another LLM. They're actually taking some critical thought to this and looking at it differently, which I think is useful and valuable. Um, but anyway, speaking about open source, I mentioned Grafana. Let's talk a little bit about them. they also had a pretty big announcement, actually, that they got another round of funding. I'm trying to see what it was here. The numbers are similar. So $270 million in additional funding. Announced that they've hit 250 million in ARR, and of course, we're identified as a leader in the latest Gartner Magic Quadrant for observability. And overall, this is good news for them. I mean, Grafana is, if you don't know them, they are one of the original observability players. They're an open source pedigree in terms of how they sort of came to market, and have done, they sort of were the standard. Now, I think there's a lot of folks that have had historically made their business by going out and saying, hey, we use Grafana at our core. Now we built, it's the open source way, right? We'll tell us all the other stuff around it. And so Grafana has attempted to steal back some of that market and have introduced a much more robust product line to sort of flesh all of that out. But I think overall this is good. It's a good sign for the market. It's a good sign for them. And but again, it goes back to sort of what we were talking about, that open source. I take a skeptical eye towards it because open source is always never truly. It's not about getting free stuff. So it's just sort of an attitude and how you approach it.
Right. But this is also a great time for Grafana because of the importance of cloud observability in general. For so many years, observability was really limited to looking at network behavior simply because that was just a much larger market. And all we could really do is kind of look at packets. But now that we are trying to look at so many different types of activity that go through cloud computing, this is really an interesting inflection point for the observability market in general, because I feel like although it is a mature market in some respects from an operational perspective, we still have yet to see how observability leads to things like financial management. I love the FinOps topic so much, and seeing directly how activities lead to costs is still not very easy in cloud, simply because you've got, again, billions and billions, that number keeps coming up, of activities that any enterprise has, any with its large cloud deployments. So the only way to look at that is through observability as a starting point. I remember back when Grafana was trying to make its way as a real-time visualization solution, and really looking at themselves just as a BI solution, which really undersold its capabilities. So I'm glad that they found this observability use case and have been so successful as a market leader, obviously, in this space for now a number of years.
Yeah, and I do agree. It's really positive. I mean, I've become a big fan of observability overall, mostly because I think it's, to a certain extent, the tail that wags the dog. I mean, we still mostly talk about observability in the context of cloud native environments that kick off a ton of digital exhaust, and we can capture all of this data and use it to actually observe what's going on. I mean, the whole reason we had monitoring in the traditional enterprise and traditional tech stack in the past was it wasn't instrumented in a way that we could actually do that. And so one of the byproducts of this, you talk about FinOps, is that it's created this sense that we should be able to do that. We should be able to collect data. We should be able to instrument it. And instead of having to predict that this is the thing I care about, collect all of this data and discern what's actually happening and whether or not I should care about it in the environment. And so I love that this is sort of infiltrating down, and you cannot have this conversation, particularly when it comes to cloud, but I think across the board, you cannot have this conversation and ignore the fact that there is performance and cost at two ends of the spectrum, and you have to find a balance point between them. And the only way you're going to do that with is data. I mean, observability is really just this fancy term that says we're going to collect all the operational data we can. We're going to feed it into something that allows us to make sense of it, right? That's really what this is about. And that's why the visualization is so important. But in order to make sense of it, I have to be looking at more than just performance. I have to be able to look at cost optimization. And Grafana, if they have a gap, in my opinion, is they're not fully going there yet. I think they will, and I think they need to. But we've talked in the past about Logic Monitor, and they just introduced a cost optimization. A company that in the Kubernetes world that I followed is Perfect Scale. They have a big focus on cost optimization. There's a number of other players out there that I think are helping organizations strike that balance point between the performance and cost and looking at it all at once. And the root of all of that is the ability to get the data. So I think, Grafana deserves a lot of credit for helping really pave the way and opening the door to all of this. And so hopefully this will give them the means to, keep fighting the good fight.
Yep, absolutely. And And it only seems that IT environments are going to get more and more complex over time, despite the attempts to try to reconcile environments and cut back a little bit. We just can't help ourselves. We always want more services, more capabilities, more apps. And in that regard, one recent funding announcement that got my attention was this little known company called Opkey, which does ERP testing automation. So in practice, they help bring your 7, 8, 10 ERPs together and figure out how to make your processes work in each of those applications through more of an automated testing process. And so they recently raised $47 million. And what I love about this company is that it was not developed by like people on high just deciding to uh, like people with deep, call it SAP, Oracle money in their bank, in their pockets. This was started by a bunch of people who were originally test engineers, and they said, "We see this problem. We are tired of dealing with this manual test issue over and over again." And as someone who did a bit of ERP testing back in the day, I can speak personally to how mind numbing and painful it can be to go through each unit test of each process through an ERP. I'm frankly glad there's finally starting to be solutions in place to help automate this capability and to help with this shift from ERP at this monolithic capability to really this aggregation of best in breed capabilities, which is really what it's become at this point.
I'm chuckling at the statement you made like 3 minutes ago when you started this, where you said that we're not going to go back, and because that was our MO. We would go through these cycles of
Mhm.
expansion, and we'd buy a bunch of stuff, and then we would come back and rationalize everything back down. And I'm chuckling because I'm trying to imagine a CIO walking in today, a new one getting hired and coming and saying, okay, we're going to go through a process. We're going to select one of everything, and that's all we're going to run. Because it just doesn't happen today. It's just
Mhm.
literally impossible. There's just too many different needs and constituencies. And so I think, that's sort of what this is. Opkey is an example of this sort of transition that we're seeing. I mean, I talk all the time to executives about the fact that this is a new state in that the tech stack complexity is only going to increase. We're going to be in a hybrid world for the foreseeable future. I think forever, to be honest, where we're going to have workloads running in all kinds of different environments. And the key is going to be getting visibility into what is going on. And so it's interesting. One of the things that Opkey is talking about in this press release is that they're calling it ERP observability. And honestly, just 6 months ago, I would have bristled at this because observability historically had a very defined meaning. It was it
Mhm.
was log, trace, and metrics, and it was cloud native, and that's what it was. But it's now become sort of code for this idea that we're going to go collect data. We're going to go collect data about your environments, and we're going to use it to make decisions. And I think it's a fair description. So there's a whole bunch of people out there talking about various forms of observability. It's become this hyper buzzword, but in this case, I think it's very appropriate, and I think it's very needed. I mean, I didn't necessarily want to talk about this mostly because I ran a application quality center of excellence for a Fortune 500 company years ago, and I think I still have the trauma from it.
Mhm.
Um, so, you know, automated testing is something that sounds so logical and is so flippin' hard to actually do and execute. And I would actually be very curious to see how well this works today and if they've truly solved for some of those issues. But the need is unquestionable, and I think that it's an interesting space because we all love to hate our ERP systems, and um, if there's something that can actually make it better and make it work. And then the last little piece on this one that I'm intrigued by is that while they're going to market and talking about um, the observability side of this and about testing, they also talk about that the same data gives insight into process performance, business user experience, and error resolution. The error resolution part I'm less interested in, but the experience and the performance are actually really, really interesting because while ostensibly testing was always about those things, in most cases it wasn't. In most cases it was, is it going to break? And in so much of what we do now is reliant on delivering an experience that delights our customers, delights our employees, makes things productive, allows things to operate effectively and efficiently. And there's an entire whole set of class of tools out there specific to ERP, in fact, that are focused on end user experience monitoring and management. And it's really interesting to kind of wonder, it's like, are they going to be going there? And is this going to help solve for that as well? Because it's a definitive need.
Yeah, anybody who's been in a large enterprise remembers having to work with a large ERP and having to do this 38-step process to do something. It might be approving a payment or giving an employee some vacation time or what have you, because the ERP forces you to do this as its way of defining the process. So now you have to learn how to work like the ERP. And the idea that we could have some sort of testing that might actually rationalize some of these processes and smooth them out to be, the 5-step process that they actually should be. I like that in theory, and especially if it can make that consistent over multiple ERPs, that's even better. So I'm probably living in fantasy land, even hoping for this. But the idea that we are getting to solutions that are even starting to think about getting towards there is at least progress.
Yeah, yeah. Don't fool yourself. I was one of my clients is a tech company who I won't name right now, but they stood me up as a new vendor, and I have my banking information on my invoice, and they had to send me this email that says, "I need a letter from you with your banking information because we use an automated process to scan our invoices, and we can't pick up your banking information from that, so you have to send it separately." It's like, wow, okay, nice. We're a tech company, and this is where we're at. I mean, this stuff
Yes.
is notoriously difficult. It's we'll be. I don't think any of us have any risk of not having jobs for a while.
Yeah, I am betting on tech just getting more and more complex over time, and we're not the only ones. We saw this article, well, more of an opinion piece earlier this week from Stephen Wolfram over at TechCrunch. It was over at TechCrunch. It was a summary of an interview of him. Obviously, Stephen Wolfram, well known as one of the great tech minds of our generation. Wolfram Alpha, Mathematica. His stamp on our tech, his tech legacy is secure. But this guy is now saying, maybe AI is too complicated for us to understand as developers. And if anybody should know, it's Stephen Wolfram. Like, no, like, are there smarter people in tech than Stephen Wolfram? Probably not. So if we've got a guy like this saying, as smart as I am, I don't think I have the training to fully understand how AIs work. So how do these other people get it? I think that's a message worth listening to.
Well, I'm not sure that I buy that he's not smart enough to understand this. I think that he probably is, but I think his point to that should be taken is that we cannot examine AI and its implications across. I think whether you're talking the most macro, like its implications on society, or even just its implications on your customers and your employees, more pragmatically in the abstract, if by only looking at it from a technology perspective. And we talked a lot about this, about whenever a new AI model is released, what's the first thing they all do? They go run up on these benchmarks, and it's like, well, it's 0.1% faster, or whatever. And it's like, that's well and good for what it is, but his point is that we're entering this domain where we need to start looking at it differently and applying this philosophically based critical thinking layer to it. Now, I took umbrage with the article a little bit, not because I disagreed with it, but because I actually feel like when it comes to technology, this has always been the problem and has always been the case. I feel like we've had so many issues historically. Most of the issues, in fact, that have plagued IT organizations can be rooted, traced back to the fact that we look at technology as if it's technology, as opposed to looking at technology as if it's a tool to enable some outcome in the business that we're trying to achieve. And that requires a set of critical thinking skills that changes the way you look at it. And I would argue that AI is in fact no different. The stakes may be bigger and the scope may be broader, but I think it's the same aspect. I've been literally for a decade talking about, if you're working in IT, the skills you need more than anything else, you can learn the technical skills. You need the business understanding, you need the critical thinking skills, you need, I've been a huge fan of design thinking, of this perspective change. And I look at systems thinking, of looking at the overall impact of everything. These fundamental skills, which are about taking that step back, and maybe not philosophical in the true sense that he's talking about philosophy, but not looking at technology strictly through a technical lens, I think is something we need across the board. And I think AI maybe is just elevating that to the point where it's starting to slap people across the face. So I'm glad he's talking about it.
Mhm.
I completely agree with it, but I also think that this is something that is extremely important across every dimension that we talk about.
Yeah, I think one minor difference doesn't really change your perspective or that how right you are. But in the past couple of years, as we've seen generative AI come in, it always speaks to you with a very confident voice, regardless of whether or not it even understands your question or not. And I think that, and it is
It tells you
develop.
how great of a question that it was, right?
Mhm.
That was a
Right.
great question.
And and that's a fundamental approach that all of these generative AIs take. Like, is that philosophically a good idea to have the same amount of confidence, whether you are 100% certain or 0% certain of what the answer should be? Is that really what we're programming for? Whereas I feel like before generative AI, even when we had model based and algorithmically based answers, at least when they were numbers, they were a little bit more binary in nature, which made it a little easier to tell whether it was right or wrong. We started getting fuzzier challenges when we were dealing with things like Google search, which started muddying the waters on how accurate something was. And now we're kind of in the weeds and have to reconsider philosophically what should the outputs be from our computing. How honest and accurate do we want these things to be? And should there be a way for these things to say, yeah, I wasn't quite sure what you said. Here's my best guess, rather than just going forward and confidently saying, yeah, you should put glue in your pizza if you want it to taste better.
And and like I said, I'm not trying to minimize the additional layer that this adds. There's no question that it does. And I mean, I'm subject to it. Like I said, I rely on it all the time, and it's one of the things I love about it, that I can throw sort of all these different pieces that maybe wouldn't have. So I'm looking at as potentially, a move at some point in the future, and been trying to evaluate areas of an area I don't know. So I'm literally able to say, well, this is I like this city, I like that city, I like this neighborhood and that these neighborhoods in the city and those neighborhoods in that city. On this new city, tell me which kind of line up where this might be aligned. Now, oh, I'm curious. I'm trying to reduce costs and I'm trying to increase my quality of life. Oh, I forgot to tell you that I'm also worried about safety, right? The
Mhm.
fact that it can sort of take all this and digest it, and to your point, it does it in a confident and conversational manner. I have to catch myself going, wait a minute, I need to go check this stuff out. I need to go double check
Mhm.
this, because I'm not talking to someone who is truly knowledgeable and truly understand. I mean, the big difference is that these models don't always even understand when it's not sure. It's just spitting out what the model spits out. And so I do think there's this philosophical layer that is necessary to start evaluating what are we doing, why are we doing it, how does it apply? And I think, trying to bring this back from a CIO's perspective, I think he's addressing it industry wise. I think that's important from a pragmatic standpoint. As a CIO, you need to be thinking about it in the same way, but now in the context of how is this going to impact your employees, how is this going to affect your customers, and it had people done that. Some of the early gaps we saw with people rolling out with car dealerships and whatever maybe would have been missed if they had that more philosophical view of asking, is this the right thing to do, and what's the impact of it? So yeah, I agree with it. It's just an interesting thing to I guess for me it was like, shouldn't have this always been the case, right? And that's, I
Mhm.
guess, where I was going.
Yeah, and I think from a very practical perspective, it means if you're building a model internally or you're tuning something, you have to figure out, are the questions that I'm asking sufficiently weighted and tested based on data? Do I actually have the right amount of data to be able to ask these questions correctly? And if not, am I going to ask my model to actually tell me, this model just doesn't have that data in it? We did not do that amount of training. Instead of trying to make a guess out of one or two instances or suggestions that might have been in the training data, but might lead to completely wrong answers.
Well, and it's also, I mean, so in my first book, I talked about something called the curse of knowledge, which was developed by a graduate student at Stanford, and basically the premise is that once you know something, it's hard not to know it, right? And so one of the challenges is that you have a bunch of people in the room that are doing this testing or having these conversations, and they know what was in the model. They helped design it, and so they can't unknow that, and so it's always going to bias their perspective. And so one of the most important things you can do, sort of wherever you are in the spectrum, is to get people into the room that have that different perspective. Intel, for the longest time, I don't, they still do. They had anthropologists on staff, and I loved it because these were people that were not technical in nature. You know, they didn't have a technical background, and they came in and asked just these off the wall questions because they looked at the world in such a different way. And whether that's, you can afford to have people like that on staff, or you just go to your local university and get some of these sorts of folks and get them in the room as you're having these conversations, I think it can just do wildly amazing things in changing how you look at it. And I guess according to Wolfram, we now should make sure that you have some philosophy majors in the room too.
Revenge of the liberal arts. I love it.
Exactly.
After 25 years of being told being asked why'd you major in liberal arts, finally I can have an answer.
All right. So from the big picture philosophy to, let's get down a little bit more pragmatic into dollars and cents. And there's two sort of on the surface unrelated stories, but I think they actually are related if you're a CIO and you're looking at budgets. And I'm actually going to bring these up in reverse order, and then you can tear
Sure.
them apart. The first is there's an article from CIO, and it's a vanilla article, basically just talking about Forrester's latest data is out, and they're saying that CIO budgets for 2025 are increasing, but they're increasing very modestly on average, but less than 10% or less, and that most of that is talent and software, and so that of course causes this whole, we've talked a lot about optimization earlier, and so a lot of focus on things like avoiding crowd sprawl and improving optimization and efficiency so that you can invest in these two critical areas for the organization. And at the same time, Hyoun found this article from I can never say the name. Diginomica? How do you say it?
Yes, Diginomica. Yep.
Diginomica. I don't know why. My wife will tell you I have trouble with certain words. They just get stuck on my tongue. Anyway, that the CEO of a company called Zora is talking about how he sees what he's calling the second act of the subscription economy, total monetization, meaning that instead of just having subscriptions, looking for these other mechanisms to monetize all over the place. And I actually find this an interesting philosophical question, because one of the things I'm advising organizations right now is sort of the opposite. I'm saying the CIOs right now are being bombed by very complex pricing schemes. They can't make sense of it. They're trying to be able to predict spend. And so the way you can create competitive differentiation is by having a very simple pricing model, making it very clear and very transparent. And Zhu, I'm not sure how it says his name, but the CEO of this company seems to be saying the opposite, like the complete opposite. And so I'm really curious your take on sort of what both these data points, when you put them together, what they mean to you.
Yeah, so I have some mixed views. Starting with the IT spend, I find it a little hard to fully analyze this because I'm a survey nerd, and one of the things they did is they asked basically, is your IT spend going up 1 to 5%? Is it going up 6 to 10%? I wish those numbers had been a bit more granular, because I feel like most companies that you run into are going to say somewhere between 1 and 10%. And if you'd sliced it up a little bit more, I feel like the data could have been a little bit better. But my that aside, I think the general trend is right, that people are trying to figure out how to spend a little bit more on IT, despite the the general uncertainty that seems to always be around this economy, whether deserved or not. There has been kind of this hesitance to spend money because you're not quite sure what's next. So IT spend is actually behind economic growth as a whole, but it is still growing. AI is obviously helping with that. And I think that's going to continue to be the case as we work on being more digital as companies. That digital trend is not going away. I think AI is helping to talk about how we can be more digital, but honestly, there's still a lot of work left in even just moving away from paper and creating processes that get rid of unnecessary signatures and unnecessary oversight.
So I want to get back to the total monetization piece, but
Mhm.
just to react to your comment here on the whole the IT spending piece, I would say I would argue that while we certainly don't want to see retraction, I think it's almost impossible to see a true retraction in spending in enterprise IT any longer. It is so critical to everything that, if you're actually reducing your spend in enterprise IT, you're pretty much just signing your death warrant. And so I think I look at these numbers fairly negatively insofar as it's going to create an environment. We've largely been in the past an environment of everyone wins, right? As long as you have a decent product and you can bring it to market, you're going to win. And I think these spending numbers indicate that there's going to be very definitive winners and losers. There are going to be those that are helping these organizations achieve their goals in very defensible ways, and others that have really cool technology looking for a business problem, and they're going to suffer in this state when the spending is constrained like this. So I think that's interesting, and I think if you're a CIO, I think you're almost certainly living this, and know that the big word here is, hey, you're not alone. I think everyone's there. But all that
Right.
said, I do
Mhm.
think it's also going to create pressure for what this other part of the story is, this total monetization for organizations to try to goose this a bit by finding other ways to monetize. And like I said, I personally think that's the wrong move, but I'm curious what you think sort of on both sides of that.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I have an MBA in pricing, so I've spent a bunch of time theoretically thinking about this
MBA
stuff.
in pricing, you can do
And
an MBA in just pricing.
pricing,
Wow. Okay.
pricing concentration, yes. And when I was looking at B2B pricing, it's seen as rational. You understand the value. There's a direct dollar exchange that happens, but it has to be thought out, which means you have to win that trust of the executive who is making that purchase, and they have to be able to see the dollars from their own perspective to be able to make that trade-off. But if you can get to that point, you can monetize based on whatever value proposition they see as most important. So if they can get an extra dollar out of their factory, or if their acquisition cost is the most important piece, you can charge right there. Or if you can extend year to year as a typical subscription, you can basically add all these nickel and dime fees that we hate as customers, but we reluctantly accept as B2B customers. Like the basic face for a successful B2B transaction is usually not a smile, but like a flat, face of
That's the
acceptance
best you
that
can hope
says,
for.
yeah, I got kind of screwed, but I'm also getting the value that I'm looking for. Like that's kind of the value that you look at for the B2B side. But the challenge is that with software pricing, especially, we have much more of a B2C mentality. Like an extreme example of that is like buying a Hermes clutch bag. Like those $9,000 Hermes clutch bags. Like I've never bought one. I'm not even sure what one looks like, but I do know that there's these things called luxury brands, and that there are rich, mostly women, who will buy these $10,000 bags. I don't know what makes them different from $100 bag, but they seem to know. They seem to be very happy about it, and they're because in their heart of hearts they know that 100x extra price is worth it. But it's totally a gut feel, and there's this kind of gut feel of am I getting screwed or not, that comes into the picture as you get closer to B2C, or does this fit my heart's desire? So I think those are the two conflicting areas. On the one hand, if you can think out every single bit of value from stem to stern, sure, you can do that B2B purchasing method. But increasingly, we have to move faster. It gives us less time to analyze, and we have to have more of a gut feeling of where that value is to make it work. So it really depends on how you're buying, what you're buying. I see this total monetization trend as being an interesting level of flexibility that will be useful for the business, but you can't just throw it in and use it for everything.
Wow. Well, we'll see if it's like I said, I'm not the pricing expert, so maybe I'm wrong on this. I'm looking at it from the perspective of how do you, maybe I'm a big fan of signaling, right? And so this is another way of signaling what you stand for and how you engage with the market. But it is interesting what you're saying. I mean, obviously, we look at companies like Oracle and SAP, and they have this really interesting relationship where their customers on the surface hate them, and yet they keep coming back for more. And it's
Very
like
much,
the only thing
yeah,
that
very much on that B2B, that end of the spectrum. Yes.
right, because to your point, because at the end of the day, whatever that value math is, it pencils out, and so they may have that, that grimace, but they keep doing it. And it reminds me of this movie that I think it was Albert Brooks, where he plays this ad executive. This is like in the 80s. And he goes nuts and he goes crazy. And I can't imagine anyone making this movie today, but basically he ends up going to like a sanitarium or whatever, and he has this brainstorm that he's going to start having real advertisement. I remember one of them was for, I think it was United, and there's the ad was like a magazine ad, a picture of this crashed plane, and it's the ad was something to the effect of, let's face it, sometimes planes crash, but United, we kill fewer of our passengers than any other airline, and it's like the true ad. And that's sort of what I feel like you're saying. It's like, I mean, it's kind of crappy no matter what. So it's just about just being good enough. And maybe it's
Yes.
true. I tend to believe that we're all human, and whether we're buying B2B or personal, well, the delta is there, that I think there's some sense in that like, if I guess maybe what I'm saying is like this whole total monetization thing. Like if I was on the receiving end of it, I think it would eventually have weight. But I guess to your point is the point at how do you find that balance point where you can just get away with it enough? I don't know. It's just another one of our crazy parts of this enterprise IT business, I guess.
Yes. Oh
Well,
gosh.
speaking of crazy parts, let's talk about our closing article here, very short one, but talking about something that we rarely talk about when it comes to IT, and that is water. We've talked a lot about natural resources in the form of power consumption,
Mhm.
but the last one, or the one that we don't talk about much, is water. Well, for the average data center in the average enterprise organization today, we are generally not using water cooled systems. They're just not that big most of the time. But in these big giant data centers, they are. And apparently, this is becoming an issue where we're actually seeing um, that they're consuming so much water. And what I found interesting about this article, that it's not just the water cooling, but it's also humidity control,
Mhm.
and that's causing this. I guess during humidity in particular, it evaporates, and it's becoming this whole drain. Which for a lot of places, ironically, the same places you often tend to want to put a data center for other reasons, they have water constraints, and so this is becoming yet another issue thanks to AI.
Right. Uh, so we looked at a couple articles from TechCrunch and Financial Times, basically talking about this. One of the numbers that really surprised me was how Microsoft said 42% of the water it consumed last year in 2023 came from areas with water stress. And I think of places like California, which we obviously have the tech. We even have the energy. We have a lot of solar energy. We have actually too much solar energy during the day and don't know what to do with all of it, but we have no
Know that.
water. Yes. So, but we have no water. So we can't run these data centers here. So, we've got to find someplace in Oregon or Washington or Idaho or somewhere that, that is willing to take this water stress that we are putting on everyone through AI and the cloud. And this is just going to become more of a problem. So I find that interesting, especially since we are dealing globally with a lot of water issues. For instance, Phoenix, I don't know how Phoenix is going to, and Las Vegas, like cities like that are going to keep getting water over the next 20, 30 years. And now we have yet another actual source that is using up billions of gallons of water and potentially stressing our water system even more. So, we're not uh, we're not ecological analysts, but it's hard to ignore the use of water. We all use it.
Well, I think this we try to end on a fun. This isn't really fun, I guess. It's like doom and gloom stuff again, but it's maybe this is one of those where it's off the beaten path, and
No,
you
wacky.
realize, yeah, you have to think about something we don't really think about, and I think that, I mentioned systems thinking the other day, and it's really hard. Part of the reason systems thinking is hard is that we all tend to focus on what's in front of us and not seeing that bigger picture of how everything is connected. And it's interesting from my standpoint. I've been in this business now for 30 some odd years. We had to make a stretch in the early days of how everything was connected, and now it's like literally everything is connected very viscerally, and I think that the tentacles reaching into all the different parts can make it hard to see all of it. So, like, this is something. I mean, I pride myself, thanks in part to doing this podcast, of staying really up to speed on what's going on around all these different things. And you sent this article over, and I'm like scratching my head, going, "Water, really?" And it's just yet another example. And so, yeah, it's the good news is we're in a business that has extremely far-reaching impact on everything. The bad news is we're in a business that has extremely far-reaching impact on everything. So we need to pay attention to it all.
Yes, we are now very entrenched in utilities, oil and gas, water, like it's fundamental forces that drive society. It's wild how IT has just become really entrenched into the world at large. And on that deep and perhaps more serious than we intended note,
Philosophical note.
yes, it's been a philosophical episode for sure. But with that, we'll call it a week. Thanks to our philosophical inspirations. Thanks to Stephen Wolfram and everyone else. And with that, please like, subscribe, comment, let us know what you think, and we'll see you next week.